Hello and welcome to our latest webinar in the Sage Politics Webinar Series 2025. My name is Fawzia Eastwood and I'm a marketing manager at Sage for the Politics and International Relations books portfolio. I'm a cisgender woman of South Asian background. I have long dark brown hair, brown eyes and olive skin, and I'm wearing a black blouse. My pronouns are she and her. Today's webinar is called Why Big Ideas Matter When Teaching Political Theory, presented by Simon Stevens, author of Political Theory, Why Big Ideas Matter, published this year by Sage. Before we start, I'd like to share some housekeeping webinar information with you. My colleague Amy Douglas is technical host of today's webinar, and she'll be co-facilitating the event. We're recording the webinar. However, we have switched off the cameras and muted the microphones for all participants except the presenter and the host. This is so that everyone will be able to enjoy the session without background noise. Also, the chat box won't be available for participants during the webinar, but if you do have any questions, we would like you to write them in the question and answer box. We'll reply to as many of those as we can during the session, with some answered live by Simon. And then we'll try to follow up with any that we didn't get around to answering today. Please take advantage of our presenters' expertise and focus any questions you may have around the content of today's webinar. As mentioned, the webinar is being recorded. We'll upload the recorded video to Sage's YouTube channel later this week. We'll also share it via email and on our social media channels. Sage is on X and also on Blue Sky, so do follow us there if you aren't already. It's at sagepub.com. We've made closed captions available during this webinar, so do switch those on if they're helpful for you. Sage is delighted to host today's webinar. Sage is a global academic publisher of books, journals, and library resources with a growing range of technologies to enable discovery, access, and engagement. Our mission is building bridges to knowledge, supporting the development of ideas through the research process to scholarship that is certified, taught, and applied across all fields of social science. Whether you're preparing to teach a course, conducting research, or looking to publish your next research paper, our Sage Politics and International Relations portfolios provide top quality, easy to access materials to help you make the best use of your time and excel in your field. We're delighted to introduce today's webinar, which will be presented by Simon Stevens, author of Political Theory, Why Bigger Ideas Matter, which published earlier this year. And he'll be referencing his book during the webinar. To introduce our presenter today. Simon Stevens is an award-winning senior lecturer in politics and political theory at De Montfort University, with extensive experience in curriculum and program design, leadership and program management. Notable achievements include the Political Studies Association Best New Lecturer Prize and first prize in the Independent Social Research Foundation's International Essay Competition. Simon has mostly published work on methods in political theory, civil disobedience, anarchist theory, and homelessness. Simon's future goals include working with UK councils regarding housing and employment opportunities for care leavers and promoting inclusive education practices. We're delighted to have you with us today. Welcome, Simon.
Hello. I used to have glorious long hair, but now unfortunately I am a fairly bald white middle-aged man with a smattering of hair left around my chin. I'm about 5'9.5". My pronouns are he and him. Today I'm going to talk about, I guess, the challenges that lecturers and students face when thinking about political theory, teaching political theory, learning political theory, but also how those kind of challenges, I guess, feed into kind of wider discussions about like politics and what theory is like. And some of those challenges I think will be localized. Maybe some of them a bit more widespread, maybe even some of them universal. That's, I guess, something that we could talk about as well during the question period of this presentation. So I'm going to talk about those, and I'm going to really talk about what, I guess, mine and colleagues and friends and peers' responses were to those challenges. Although I guess the book's got my name on it, I like to think about this as something that like has developed over the years since I took over a political theory module back in 2017 when I was an early career researcher. Maybe I still am, who knows, these days. And I guess when I took over that module, a DMU at the time, the Montfort University where I work, had won an award for sort of diversity in the student body, but I kind of felt like what we were teaching didn't really reflect that. So I went on this kind of journey of trying to expand that, which was a learning process for myself. And so then I guess those challenges that we face today, we'll talk a lot, I guess, about decolonization, diversification, stuff like that, particularly in the political theory canon, which is like challenging itself, but interesting. But I also want to talk about how those experiences became a book that I think does respond to some of those challenges, but I want to sort of emphasize that this is kind of an iterative thing. It's a constant, ongoing process. But I think that it's helpful sometimes to write those experiences down. So I think we'll talk about those specifically, and maybe some of the features of the book and how the book responds to those challenges, and how my experiences fed into that. Okay, so I guess this is probably an image that a lot of us are familiar with. So the first challenge really in thinking about teaching political theory is interaction, right? I've labeled this interaction, but I guess it's important to sort of, I don't think I really need to dwell too much on sometimes like there are attendance issues and things like that. And they could be for all sorts of reasons. Like this could be a kind of post-COVID thing. This could be a sort of problems with, I guess, mental health or interest. And maybe this isn't at all universities as well. I think something that post-92, 1992 universities in the UK suffer with a lot sometimes is attendance. Some of that is also related to things that we have very little control over. So it might be that students have care responsibilities, or that they have to work to fund their tuition fees and so on and so on. So it's kind of important that when they are in the classroom, that we are actually, I guess, doing something collaborative, important. But at the same time, like, and I'm aware of this with my own sort of background. Like when I went to university, it was very much like, oh, I need to get a job at the end of this because, I didn't really have sort of many opportunities otherwise. I mean, get into university, cool, get sort of free education at the time. And so I'm aware of the instrumental value of higher education degrees and higher education learning. But we sort of also have to balance that with, I guess we want to call something like civic learning, holistic learning. I still believe in higher education as a sort of social value. But as lecturers and students, we've got to sort of balance this increasingly sort of need for education to actually instrumentally or transactionally equip students with a CV to get a job, and all the problems that come with that, at the same time as trying to do something that also is interesting and challenging. So I think that all kind of sort of rolls into the idea of how do we interact with our students and how do we think about political theory. We really have to talk about AI because, like a lot of things, we sort of still haven't really figured that out. And I think back when I was a student doing my degree from 2002 to 2005, and maybe sort of you could go back a bit further in the 90s and the 80s, what people were learning at university, by the time they were out of university and in sort of the world of work, if you like, it wasn't, the skills you were teaching were not that different. I don't think that we exist in a similar time today. I think that we don't even really know what a work environment is going to be in 15, 20 years' time. So we sort of actually, education has become a bit of guesswork with the role of AI, both in education and in the workplace and in automated learning and things like that. So we kind of also have to guess and predict what skills and knowledges are important for our students without really knowing what the world is going to look like in 20 or 30 years. I think that there's still value in actually, reading a book or really extensively getting involved in the resources that we provide to our students. So, I'll talk about this a bit more when I talk about the responses to this and the book and things. But I really wanted to emphasize that there is a depth of learning that I think we still need. I think there's still value. Like, how do you get a student to read a book? Should we get a student to read a book anymore? Is that still of value? And I tend to think that the emphasis on changing education, AI, automated learning, all that kind of stuff is the worst thing that happened is that we think it's just about an arms race in terms of software. So, AI companies producing software that can circumnavigate the software that universities use to recognize when AI is being used, and so on and so on. And I don't really think, that really leads anywhere particularly fruitful. I think really the only long-term meaningful solution to it is to actually make our students care and feel motivated about what they're doing. So, political theory, that can be quite challenging. I think in the UK context, sometimes it feels like, particularly when thirsties arrive, in a lecture theatre, and they don't really even know what theory is. So you really have to kind of make it relevant to them in a way that they feel like they're not just trying to get a grade or a mark, but they're actually learning tools to express themselves and understand the world around them. And when that becomes important to them, the motivation kicks in. And I think if they see it as a way of expression, right, and not just learning something, then I think that's how we get subject relevancy. But we also can't lose the theoretical aspect of it. I mean, I often say to my students, like, we'll make a statement, right, based on some kind of empirical evidence, right? Okay, let's say there are more cisgendered, like, white men in management than there are women, or women of something at birth. And, why do you think that is? And they'll say a few things. And then, what should we do about that? Should we do anything about that? And then they'll say a few more things. And then it's really just about getting to understand that, well, they've just kind of just done theory, right? They've done a theoretical explanation about why something is the way it is. And then they're moving into a normative theory about, should we do something about that? So a lot of the time, it's about understanding what issues are of importance to young people in higher education, in terms of subject relevance, and showing them that actually it does connect to the things that we study. And I guess the sort of second challenge that then comes on from that is, well, decolonizing a curriculum is something that is quite regularly talked about, and in all forms of political discourse at the moment, right? We talk about decolonizing campuses, we talk about decolonizing history, even the names of roads, and so on and so on. So this is not just something limited to higher education. But I think the challenge in this is we haven't really figured that out. And there's different theories of decolonization, and there's I guess a sort of surface level where you might think it's just about providing equal opportunities, and then there's a sort of deeper level where you think it might be about dismantling institutions, behaviors, even mindsets that we think are associated, were associated with colonization. And then you've got forms of neo-colonization and stuff like that. So even as a society, we haven't really kind of figured out what it even is. And yet at the same time, there's lots of kind of demand and interest in doing it. And within the higher education sector, within universities, that can mean all sorts of things. It could mean your curriculum. It could mean even your pedagogy. Is your pedagogy reminiscent of, dominant forms of colonization, and so on and so on. It could mean assessments. And these are things that actually are research projects in themselves. And we're supposed to kind of be able to sort of, I guess, almost immediately understand what it is, even though we're still theorizing about it within academic research. So that's a challenge. And, if we're talking about decolonization, well, that's really only one form of diversification, right? There's all sorts of other kind of theoretical frameworks now and concepts that we perhaps should then also consider if we're thinking about diversifying all of our curriculum, and so on and so on, like disability theory, queer theory. How does that sit with colonization? And where does the sort of traditional subjects and thinkers that we have in political theory, where do they sit with this? Can they be in conversation with that? So that's a challenge that we also really, really kind of face. And then with all sorts of things like this, there's the kind of, I guess, marketing appropriation of this. There's the hashtag decolonization movement, which, at what point does something go from a meaningful, pedagogic, educational change, which should be exploration, right? It's not like we have it all figured out. At what point does that sort of slide into a marketing sort of at all. And like, what should we do about that? Can we do anything about that? Does that, that's also a challenge us as lecturers face, I guess, and students in trying to, because we want to be authentic about this, right? Especially if we are, teaching students that feel that their identities kind of are reflected in these sort of movements. Like, they're just not going to trust you if they think that you're doing this because the university have told you to, because it's good for, their marketing or recruitment. So there's still got to be this authentic kind of meaning behind it. So that's really hard too. A lot of the time as well, when we talk about decolonization, right? I sort of mentioned before about different ideas about what it is. Is it isn't it decolonizing the mind? Is it just about institutions, laws, behaviors, international relations, so on and so on? But a lot of the time when we do introduce literature that is outside of a conventional kind of political theory module, I think we sometimes tend to treat it as something very specific, right? Oh, well, Frantz Fanon had these ideas because he's writing in this time, about France and Martinique and independence, right? And it's almost as if then sometimes we kind of do that a disservice. We often will treat writers like John Stuart Mill and Ideas on Liberty as a universal idea. Oh, yes, this can be universally thought of as and applied. And sometimes in decol literature, actually, we do it disservice when we think about it's only rising out of its specific context. Can we actually read Fanon as a thinker that has ideas that are universally applicable? So that debate about whether something is universal can be applied to everything at all times, everywhere, sometimes actually applying that and thinking about decolonizing thinkers and literature and diverse sort of theory and things like that, I guess that's also another change. Where do these, to put it simply, where do these different kind of new ideas that we're piecing together to form this new kind of way of thinking about political theory, where do they sit with the conventional ideas? So that's also a really challenge. How do we slot them in? Who do we remove? Can we remove certain thinkers without disadvantaging our students if they want to go on to do a master's or certain jobs? You wouldn't want to walk into a master's political theory program without knowing who John Rawls is, for example. So that's also a challenge. How do we balance that? I'll talk about this a bit more, I guess, in terms of the responses, but I think for me, first of all, we have to say that like this is iterative, this is a process, and much like discourses around the diversification and DEI and decolonization are also a process outside of universities. They're a process within them. So how do these different ideas that we want to bring in sit alongside conventional canonical ideas? I think that we should think about political theory as a set of concepts related to a fundamental question about how we should live together, which I'll go into a bit more detail later. So I'm not saying when I present this that like a chronological historical approach to political theory is bad. It's got lots and lots of benefits, in particularly, if you're going to do the classic sort of Plato through Nietzsche or whatever, you can chart the historical context of those ideas, and giving historical context helps our students make a lot of sense of the big political philosophical theory ideas that they're getting. So there's loads of advantages to that. But I guess one of the difficulties when you're thinking about decolonizing curriculum is that when you bring in, let's say, ideas like Fanon's kind of ideas on violence, or you bring in some queer theory and disability theory, it just feels like it's tagged on at the end, like in week 27. And what I sort of wanted to do was actually make sure that the students were questioning everything they were learning from the beginning, rather than sort of like a gotcha moment at the end where you sort of say, okay, well, we've learned all this stuff, but now let's talk about Patricia Hill Collins and Black feminist thought, which, maybe undermines Kant's ideas and positivism and stuff like that. We don't want to tag that at the end in week 27. And that's one of the, I guess, disadvantages of a chronological way of studying these ideas, that they feel tagged on. And then maybe students really don't get enough time to think about them, express themselves in assessments, because they're probably already thinking about their assessments earlier on in the year. So that's a kind of another challenge that we face, really, in terms of diversity our curriculums. I don't think I could talk about this without, I wouldn't forgive myself if I didn't talk about this. And it actually, in terms of workloads, and it was a fundamental motivation for writing the book, in fact. And I would just lay my flag and pin it to the mast. The biggest barrier to diversifying any politics program our workloads and increasing admin work. And we are getting, as researchers, less time to do our research. But also, in addition to that, because we have such little time in comparison to previous years, I guess, I think that we start to develop this instrumental approach to our own reading that our students have, because like I sort of sometimes feel like if I'm reading something that's not directly related to an output, a paper that I want to write, or a book or something, that I'm sort of wasting my time, or I need to get back to doing something that has the instrumental immediate output. And this is really bad. And it also means that I think, it's really hard to go back and maybe relearn some stuff, read some stuff we never read, because we want to put it into our subjects, because we want to diversify it. And I want to emphasize that when I'm saying diversifying it, this is not just about ticking a box or social justice. There's also like a selfish reason for this. This is enriching our subjects. It is making it more intellectually expansive, right? So it's not patronizing. It's not in a patronizing sense. Now that takes a lot of work. Like it takes a lot of reading, takes a lot of learning, like self-reflection, but it also takes going to conferences, talking to colleagues, meeting up with them. And if it's not related to a sort of research output, it's hard to sort of force yourself to spend time on these kind of things, because you feel so pressured. Like we live in what I guess a lot of us would call a publish or perish culture within academia. And if we aren't publishing enough, our jobs are at risk. Funny. So I think that, so how do we solve that? That's a huge challenge. Unfortunately, I can't take apart late stage capitalism, but what I can do is offer maybe two things. Like collaboration for me in this experience was absolutely key. There were loads of people I talked to when I went to conferences, people that challenged me, and also kind of tutored me, Jonathan Floyd, Keith Dowding in particular. And there were colleagues that I worked with and really helped me, like Pina and Amina. And Amina and I, for example, wrote a decolonizing politics module together. We taught it together. We even were in the classroom together, one or two times. And the students really enjoyed that. So that collaboration not only meant that I think the module was much better than it would have been if I wrote it on my own, but it also really actually enabled both of us to do these things with our current workloads. And so this really was a key motivation of writing the book, right? This wasn't just about diversifying the subject, starting that conversation. It wasn't just about students. It was also just actually seeing that it takes a lot of work and a lot of time for lecturers to actually do this. So I thought, how can I help in that way? How can I what can I contribute, I guess, that gets get people on that kind of journey, I guess. As cheesy as that sounded, I mean, it sounded cheesy in my own ears, but that generally was part of it. So, okay, so, well, I've talked a little bit about the responses, but let's go into a little bit more detail. So it's really hard to talk about these kind of things too, because I don't want to patronize anybody, because we've all got different situations when we walk into a lecture theatre, and I've got certain privileges that other people don't, which make it a lot easier for me. But I won't go too much into detail on pedagogy other than when I sort of talk about the book a bit. And I sometimes think that maybe we overemphasize different pedagogies when actually, particularly in context of, you're talking about, okay, well, let's diversify a subject. Trust is actually just really important, the trust from your students. And that means you have to be authentic and real. And I think sometimes that means that, rather than being this objective, standoffish, well, on the one hand, on the other hand, I think they sometimes learn to trust you. But if you do give your opinion, but you also give equal weight to the opposite opinion, so that encourages a sort of a collaborative way of learning together and things like that. But I found in my experiences, and this translating to the book, the best thing to do with getting students interested is to start with a problem, and a problem that speaks to them, and then get them to try and think about why that problem is happening, and then what they should do about it, and then sort of congratulate them afterwards, particularly with students that are, not coming from the best schools. and are walking into a classroom and don't really even sort of understand what political theory is, like to get them to understand that it is accessible, that they can do it. And it's not just about getting them interested, but making them feel that they've got agency, right? That they are doing it and they are able to do it from the very beginning, right? And I think that helps to demystify what theory is, you know, in particular. And like thought experiments get quite a bad reputation sometimes. You know, a lot of people got to criticize thought experiments. I have done so myself. But actually, as a, you know, maybe as a research tool, there's problems with thought experiments. But as a pedagogic tool, like I just found that students, like, they just love them. Like everybody loves a problem set up to, you know, set to them. You know, imagine I mean, even the trolley car one, right? It gets them interested because I think that's just part of like learning, that people want to, if they get presented with a problem or something that makes them rethink an idea, that gets them excited. So I do think that you can do all that stuff. And so then I thought, well, how do you translate over to a book? You know, you start with a problem and then you introduce the theory as an explanation and introduce the theory as a possible solution to the problem. But if you start with the problem first, then I think that gets them invested. What is that problem? Well, I guess I took a lot of influence from Jonathan Freud's definition of like normative political theory, political philosophy, as being a set of questions, rather than going in and saying, okay, political theory are these 10 topics for all time, right? You will always study law, you always will study justice and human nature. Those are great, interesting topics. But what I would do is take this definition, like how should we live together? Why should we live that way and not another? And can we even find a way that we all agree on? This is what Jonathan Freud kind of defines normative political theory as. And I found that if you know, I would put this on the board, and so I put it on the, you know, first page of the book, because what I'd say to the students is, well, have a look. If this defines the subject, where do you kind of stop? And where do you, what other kind of subtopics or topics come out of this question? If we just look at this as this is just the definition of the subject, political theory. It's part of the demystifying kind of side of it. And I would ask them to sort of like imagine that they were, you know, like that annoying person. That's what political philosophers are, right? They're the annoying people in a bar or a cafe that sort of stop and say, actually, have you thought about it this way? And I got them to sort of do that. And sometimes they would stop and say, how should we live? Well, I'd actually stop at the we part of the question and say, well, hang on a minute, who is the we here, right? And so that would lead them to sort of think about theories of citizenship, theories of othering, right? How dominant groups become dominant and hegemonic, and how minority groups get marginalized. And that has a whole sort of even further kind of set of subtopics from that. So they might stop there. They might stop at the should and realize that political theory is about changing the world. Like, you know, in the words of Marx, like, it's not just about describing it, but it's about doing something about it. They might kind of focus on, you know, the third part of the question, right? Which is, well, actually, there is no answer to this that applies to all humans in all over the world, in geographic, different regions, different genders, different sexualities, like different kind of cognition and so on and so on. You can't apply universal rules like this. And if you try to apply universal rules, that's just another form of imperialism. But then they kind of get stuck and go, okay, well, does that mean everything's relative and everything's culturally relative? And now we're stuck at relativism. And it's ambitious to start with this as your opening salvo when you're teaching political theory to students. But I think the purpose here is not for them to come out of the first class going, aha, I understand the tensions between universalism and relativism. The point is to get them like interested, curious, like excited. The point is to actually disrupt what their presumptions about what political theory is, because I think they're probably expecting to walk in and be told it's these 10 subjects. But what we actually would do would create the subjects and the topics of what made up the subject ourselves by linking it back to this question. What's relevant? What comes out of this question? And I found that as I did this more and more with students, I did actually sort of get 12 topics that came out of this. So I thought, okay, well, if these topics have come out of this question or definition of what political theory is, then maybe that's how we should teach it for the next X years, right? So I thought that was kind of, again, it was an iterative process which led to me deciding on what the chapters of the book should be. What is also quite interesting, I think, is that we actually talked a lot about methods, and talking about methods is, I guess, not always common in a political theory undergraduate textbook and stuff, but actually they realized that it was because it was very political, because, you know, we would, again, if you're thinking about building the subject up and moving it to a concept, sort of different concepts and different kind of thinkers within those concepts arguing with each other. Let's say, for example, you know, you want to talk about, let's say you want to teach Kant in that very typical sense, right? Immanuel Kant, and you want to talk about categorical imperatives and how should we live together. And the answer to that is these three questions, and the most important one being, well, you should only do something that you're happy everyone else would do, and that's the universal law. And if you can answer that and say, yeah, I'm happy, like I'm happy with property rights because everyone will have property rights. Okay, cool. That's the universal kind of approach. But you put that in competition with Black feminist thinkers like Patricia Collins, who then kind of say, well, this very objective way of approaching questions, which removes your identity from the question, that was a problem for people like Patricia Collins. But it's also interesting because this definition of political philosophy doesn't tell us the format that it takes. It's not necessarily, therefore, that political theory is only in monograph or essay or article or paper, but it could also be in other formats. And I think that could also interest students, right? You know, in particular with Black feminist thought, Patricia Collins wanted to study the origins of it, you know, couldn't study it through academic papers, the history of it, because Black women were excluded from universities in America at the time, right? So she looked for those early political thought, a collective form of thought in music, literature, daily conversation, everyday behavior. And again, that demystifies it. And I found that that was really helpful in getting students to feel like theory wasn't just something that they looked at in a book, but something that they did every day of their life, and actually was something that would help them understand the world around them, rather than being just something they've got to learn because they're studying politics. So I've kind of talked a little bit about the third response of workloads, and co-teaching, I think, is something that would be great. And, you know, we would invite guest speakers along, things like that, because, you know, again, forms of identity and lived experience are important in terms of knowledge. And sometimes, you know, I sort of couldn't provide that. So that was quite useful. And that also then helped in terms of, you know, writing the chapters and speaking to people and collaborating with people on some of the topics of it. Yeah, like I said, I guess we just don't have that much time ourselves to go away and relearn the things that, or learn new things that we want to teach, especially if we feel like it doesn't have an instrumental research value, because we have those pressures of publish or perish and stuff like that. So then I guess one of my response to the workloads problem was, I'm just going to write this book. And therefore this book isn't just about, you know, student learning and things like that, but it's for lecturers. And it's there, I guess, as I wanted it to be a sort of it can be a pick up and play thing, right? I want it to be self-contained. I want it to have all the features that it needed for someone to deliver a political theory module. But I also wanted it to be for those that are to act as a guide for those that would want to be a bit more proactive in themselves, kind of constructing a political theory module. So it could be more of a kind of guide that they refer to sometimes, and then that they would get inspiration from to kind of go further or do something else. So it's meant to be those two things. And I kind of say that because I don't want to say that I've produced something that has fixed the problem for all time, because you can't say that when we haven't really agreed what decolonization naturally is or should be, or the extent to which we should decolonize and diversify stuff. We haven't agreed, and I don't think we ever will. I think that will always be an iterative changing process. At the same time, I wanted people to be able to pick something up because they were stressed from work and go, right, I can deliver this and it will work, and I can deliver this, and it's been a really well kind of thought out process, right? So it's meant to be those two things at the same time, and I don't think that is intention. So in terms of the approach and then an understanding and learning political theory, the kind of what I actually did was take what I would call a disruptive canonical approach. So I took this idea that, yeah, there's this decolonizing initiatives and movements and ideas, and then there's these other kind of sort of theories and stuff that we should add in, like, you know, again, we shouldn't just stop at sort of, you know, there's lots of forms of identity politics and intersectionality. So I wanted to bring in like queer theory and disability theory as serious forms of theory. But I also didn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because like canonical thinkers say really important things, and it's important that we teach our students the ideas that have shaped the world and they understand them. And so then I wanted to bring sometimes these things in conversation then. So like, for example, on the chapter on property, well, at the same time as talking about John Locke's theory of property and Nozick's ideas, that seems a perfect opportunity to then move into, within the same chapter, theories of reparation. And, you know, I think that similarly, you know, I guess talking about theories of human nature, then you would consider the fact that, well, you know, to what extent do we think about indigenous creation myths, oral histories as forms of theory? Should that also kind of speak within these spaces? So I took, I guess, a conceptual approach instead of a chronological one, where it was almost as if, you know, when students are reading this book, that they're sort of like judges and they're looking at different views, right? Positivism versus standpoint theory. Okay, well, this is what Kat says, this is what Patricia Collins says. Now, they may not have ever been in conversation, but that's why one of the features of the book is that I actually do justify in each chapter why I've picked the ideas or the thinkers I have and why I've put them in conversation with each other and talked about their different contexts so the students understand that, right? Why that is the case. I thought it was also very important that they engage with the primary text. So there's lots of text boxes that are what I would call like the exciting bits. You know, there's always quotes that are the exciting quotes, and I wanted the students to kind of see a quote and go, wow, that's super interesting. I'm going to go off and have a look at the book. So at the same time, I guess one of the other challenges that we have is getting students to reference properly. So giving them some kind of exposure within the sort of summaries and the sections of the text, and almost presenting the chapters as if you do within a journal, so that students would get an understanding. You know, I always thought it was kind of strange that textbooks are written in a way that's so different to the way that we write and publish in journals. I always thought that was just a bit weird. Like, why aren't we referencing properly in textbooks? Why are we not using primary sources and then engaging with secondary sources? Because students will be seeing this and learning good practice about what they should do when they write their assignments and their essays and things like that. So I wrote the chapters a little bit more like we would write in journals, I guess, than a sort of just sort of straightforward summaries. So, you know, I would start with a learning outcome to get that interest, and the overview would be a justification of the thinkers that are in the book, because it's not chronological, right? It's quite wild to take ideas, maybe even someone from 200 years apart, and say, well, they're actually talking about the same concept, they're in different points of view. You have to justify that. And that again would also get students thinking about how they would come up with their own creative combinations of thinkers and ideas in their own assessments, and that was also really interesting for classroom discussions. Yeah, the other thing is that I would go into sort of sections of more or development of the idea. So sovereignty is a really good example of this. Or, you know, again, to be canonical, theories of sovereignty, I put Thomas Hobbes in it, right? But within the same chapter, I would talk about Carol Paton's sexual contract, Charles Mill's racial contract, so that students have, you know, all views on what social contract theory is, right? There's a gender lens to it. There's a race sort of element to it. Some nice music going on outside. Great soundtrack to finish off the presentation with. So yeah, I kind of, again, I wanted to avoid that thing where things are tagged on at the end. Actually, they're talking about the same thing. Let's put them in the same space. And I added in sort of example tasks and assignments. I always tried to get students to think up their own essay titles and stuff, but I often found sometimes they wanted to be given one, because some people react to that with excitement. Oh, I get to sort of make up my own stuff. Other people react to that with a bit of panic. Like, what do I do? I don't know. So just some examples of that, adding to the fact that it could be self-contained. You know, here's your text. Here's what they mean. here's where you should go, in the go deeper section to find more secondary sources for assessments. Here's a reference list in the chapter so you can actually see what I've referenced, so you can go off and read them. And here's some example assessment titles, so you've got an idea of what you might want to write. So it's bringing that gap between, I guess, textbook publication and academic publication. It's lessening that gap and bringing them closer together. And I think that is important when we're teaching and learning political theory. And I'm not allowed to say these are buzzwords, but so I think it's something that's accessible, it's relevant, it's contemporary. I think it, some of the chapters, the chapter on climate theory, for example, was really interesting for me to write because I had to go off and learn a bit about that. And I found that was really interesting because political theory is not just this past-looking thing and not even just this contemporary thing, but also this future forward-looking thing. And so I think I've tried to anticipate some of the discussions that are also on the horizon, as well as the ones that we've got now, so that it feels not just relevant, but future-oriented for our students that are learning it today. So I guess that's it, really. One of my colleagues today said, "Why don't you like small ideas?" That was Andrew. So I didn't mean to exclude small ideas, but I think big ideas are more important. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. That was a very thought-provoking and insightful presentation. And now we have come to the question and answer section. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Amy, and she will be facilitating this section. Over to you, Amy.
Thanks, Felicia. Hi, everyone. My name's Amy, and I'm the marketing executive for our politics list here at Sage. I'm a white cis woman with dark brown hair, and I'm wearing a light blue t-shirt. My pronouns are she/her. So yeah, as Felicia said, if you've got any questions, just pop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and we'll get to them if we can. But we have had some questions sent along in advance. So we'll go through those first. The first of which is, which topic do you find the most engaging and thought-provoking for students?
So first of all, I guess I would say that reparation theory was something my students were really interested in. And I think that was because it was something that they felt spoke directly to their own politics. But I guess it's also something that's just so, I think it's very present in contemporary politics, and it's also complex. So we would have discussions about whether or not then, if you're, for example, your sort of great grandparents were the Windrush generation, would you have to pay reparations, right? And so on and so on. There's really kind of complex issues, talking about who was in power, who's responsible, what forms reparation take. Are they symbolic? Are they material? Should they be both? So you actually end up talking about everything from sort of like reparations for indigenous land theft or slavery to the sort of symbolic stuff of like returning artifacts from museums. So I think they found that really engaging, but also methods, which sounds odd, but when I guess you ask, well, okay, well, how do we figure out how we should live together? When you talk about the subject like that, instead of just presenting it as a sort of, it's about law, it's about justice, about sovereignty. When you ask that question first, you realize that in order to answer it, there's all sorts of problems around whether or not you should be objective and detached and remove your identity or feed your identity into that question. And so that actually was quite interesting, I think, for a lot of students. And I guess finally, the one that sticks out in my mind as something that they were really interested in was the chapter on, or the section on disaster theory. And I think it's just something because they've never really done before, right? This idea that there should be a whole subset of political theory that's focused on climate disasters, what they are, what happens after them, what causes them, how to prevent them. And again, I think that's just because it feels so relevant because we're talking about climate change, but also it's something that's so familiar because they're seeing it out there in the world, but unfamiliar because they never really learn it in the classroom, which is a bad disconnect. So I think they were happy to see that disconnect sort of solved, I guess.
Yeah, totally. And I guess kind of linked to that, we've had a question in the Q&A box, which is, do you have any strategies for getting students to read?
Yeah, so in the book, I tried to pick out the sort of meaningful, but like exciting, sexy quotes, right? So, you know, stuff that really, one example actually that really comes to mind is Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Herland, which is a novel, but part of this was to think about coming outside of traditional formats, right? And political theory, particularly around early feminism and stuff, had a lot of storytelling element because novels were seen as a much more acceptable way for, you know, mostly middle-class white women to express themselves. And Charlotte Perkins Gilman's got this fantastic quote about marching men, like whether men are digging the ground or soldiers marching into, you know, conquered territories or kings and so on and so on. The world is made up of men. And when you think woman, you just think woman the sex. And I think students would read those and just sort of be a bit surprised that they were so evocative and curious. But I also would say that in terms of, I guess, a strategy in the classroom, you know, face-to-face time is important, but sometimes you can dial back on that and say to students, okay, well, look, don't come in for the next lecture. I want you to spend an hour reading at home, so that when you come into the seminar, we are actually all walking in with some kind of idea or understanding, and you can, yeah, because you're taking it out of their timetable schedule. It means that they were doing it, and I found that was quite a useful way of getting them to read.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think kind of taking the lectures out of the timetable is something I haven't heard of before. So yeah. Our next question is, in light of the anti-DEI policies being enacted around the world, how should our teaching be directed?
Yeah, it's quite difficult because there are points where, you know, you shouldn't be objective, right? And you sort of should say something. But I think in terms of navigating those kind of things, and also navigating when people are exposed to certain ideas and maybe even like radicalization and stuff like that, is that what we're actually trying to do alongside ideas of social justice or whatever is make the subject better. And you make the subject better by expanding it from this incredibly narrow focus. Now, when you go off and, you know, research and become an expert, you tend to have a narrow focus, right? But when you're teaching students, you want to give them the whole broad set so that they can choose which thing that they want to go off in more detail about. And, you know, we're not teaching, you know, not putting queer theory into a book to just show how woke I am. Like, it's really like interesting. And the same thing with disability theory. It's like it's really important. So I, you know, tell students that a lot of these different theories are just kind of like, you know, different types of glasses that you put on with different sort of color lenses that just give you a different explanation of why the world is the way it is. And so what I think the way that we present it, you know, we shouldn't forget that we're actually trying to make the subject better. And I don't think anyone can object to that.
Definitely. That kind of links to our next question as well, which is, when the everyday person says this doesn't affect me, one, why is that not true? And two, what can be said?
Yeah, so I guess there's a sort of patronizing way of doing it, and I don't mean that as an insult, but it's hard. I mean, in the sense of it's hard to avoid patronizing someone. You know, you ask them about things they care about, and then you go, ha, well, that's obviously something that, you know, relates to, I don't know, logical positivism, or like the personal is political, and so on and so on. And it can be effective doing that, because I think that, again, you know, you demystify theory is actually to sort of make it relevant, to talk to students about what, you know, how they can understand the world around them or why things are happening around them is actually almost certainly out there in a theory. And sometimes learning that theory can help you be more reactive, can give you a sense of agency, but also give you a sort of, I guess, a sense of understanding about why the way that things are the way they are. So I think that, like, yeah, if people are saying, oh, that doesn't really affect me, well, there's almost certainly something out there that will even explain that. He's talking about nihilism and why nihilism exists. Theory is always relevant, and we need to sort of demystify it in the sense of that it's something that people, the students, can access and are already doing. Like they're already doing it. Like as soon as you ask them a question, you know, why are young men committing suicide? Why are sort of a third of people in prison? Why have they got like learning disabilities? It's already there. I think it's people are already thinking about it, and it's just making them realise that they're probably already doing theory.
Yeah, thank you. So that's the end of all of our questions that we've got for this session, unless anyone has any last minute ones they want to pop in the chat. But thank you, Simon, for your insightful answers. And if not, I will pass back to Florsia.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Amy, for the question and answers, and Simon for answering to all of those. Very, very thought-provoking and lots of food for thought there, literally. So that does take us to the end of this session. And if I see there are no more questions, so we'll wrap up now. All that remains is for me to say thank you very much. And just a quick reminder, if I can just get the next screen up, just to remind you of the link that you can go to get more information about Simon Stevens' book, Political Theory, Why Big Ideas Matter. And you can buy that book with a discount of 25% using the code SAGE-AUTH25. My slides seem to have got stuck, so I can't show you that again. But when we follow up with the recording, we will send that to you as well at that time. And if you're a lecturer, just a reminder that you can request an electronic inspection copy from our webpage too. We'll be sending you an email webinar link over the coming few days, and so you can watch it again. You can share this presentation that the recording with any colleagues who may be interested and may want to see it as well. So once again, thank you very much, Simon, for your time today and for the very engaging, very insightful presentation. And thank you also, Amy, for co-hosting the Q&A session, all the technical support as well to help facilitate. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.